Hello, welcome to Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. I'm Stephen Meyer, and this is part three of a series based on my essay entitled Metal Mindfulness, Enhancing Mental Health with Heavy Music, right? And I'm arguing in this paper that heavy metal, or heavy music in general, can be an excellent tool for encouraging mindfulness or helping us to stay in the present, right? When we're in the present, we're not worrying about the past or dreading the future in any way. We're giving our mind a rest. And in many ways, we're at our healthiest when we're in the present, right? Certainly breathing techniques and yoga and these types of things can help with that. Meditation, of course, right? But I believe using music, and indeed heavy music, can also get you there, can help you stay present. Now, most people, when they meditate, if they use music at all, right, they typically are going to use ambient music, atmospheric music, sort of synthesizer droning and real peaceful kind of stuff, right? That's fine. I'm not saying that's a problem, but I think, yes, heavy, smashing, bombastic music can get you there as well, right? And that's what I've been arguing in this series. In part two, we looked at this more specifically, and I argue the best types of music, if you're going to use, say, heavy metal for mindfulness, tends to be music that's more complicated because it challenges your mind to stay present and stay active. And typically music that you don't know super well, okay? Because music that's forcing you to learn as you go along with it is also keeping you active and in the moment, so to speak, right? And so we use the example of Iron Maiden Senjutsu as a fantastic tool for staying in the present, right? And by and large, what we're doing is we're looking at specific parts of the music and concentrating on that as the album goes by, and that's what's sort of keeping us in the moment. And I provided what I hope were sort of some helpful tips on how you can do that as you're listening to an album such as Senjutsu or any other heavy album that's complicated and challenges you a little bit, right? But in this third part, I know there's folks out there that would rather not be challenged with new music, so to speak, that they just like listening to the old stuff. While I do believe that's second best for mindfulness, you still can do it, but you have to approach this in a different way. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this particular episode. All right. So let's share the old screen here and get rolling. So approaching old heavy favorites in a new way. All right, little background before we dive right into that. How often have you played a song or heard something on the radio and thought, that takes me back, right? Well-known pieces of music can elicit emotional responses that encourage you to mentally relive portions of your past, good or bad, right? For instance, nearly every time I hear Bandolier by Budgie, I'm reminded of road hockey games that I played as a kid. Not sure why, but anytime I play it, I always flash back to that, right? And then continuing on with this sort of little hockey motif, Restless Breed by Riot will summon up ice hockey as a teenager. And early Metal Church, whether it be the first album or The Dark, the second one, will activate mental images of ball hockey during my young adult years, as it turns out, right? Less happily, Vapor Trails by Rush will usually flash me back to a particularly troubling hospital stay, even though this masterwork remains as ever a continuing source of high entertainment. So I don't avoid playing Vapor Trails because I love the album so much, so I'm never going to avoid it. But inevitably, as I'm playing parts of it, I'm flashing back to a hospital bed that, a health issue that happened to me many, many years ago, right? So like any fan, I could describe countless other memories that are triggered by certain pieces of music, right? When an album, a song, or even just a fragment of a melody line causes one to reminisce and fall into a daydream, this is not necessarily a bad thing, right? However, for our discussion here and what I'm talking about, this is not the type of mind wandering we want to encourage. In fact, we're trying to guard against it, right? Such ruminations work against efforts to use active listening to invoke presence, right? Because you're taken out of the moment. When you're reminiscing about, that song takes me back, you're not in the moment anymore, right? Your mind is wandering, it's meandering, so you're not present. So here we're trying to stay present. We're trying to use music to stay present. So this is the type of stuff we're trying to guard against, right? Okay. Similarly, strong familiarity tends to negate much of the musical complexity used for mindfulness. So like I was saying, ideally you want to use albums or songs that you don't know super well. I find that that's the optimal choices for mindfulness, right? For example, is there anything left in AC/DC's Back in Black to digest, right? Most hard rock and metal fans know this song and album, for that matter, backwards and forwards. Sure, it's still great to hear the classics, right? But anything from this period of AC/DC would be far from my first choice as a tool for presence, right? So this is the reason I find that newer music works best, i.e. new for you. That is not, it doesn't necessarily have to be recent, but if you choose an album that you don't know, it could be from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, whatever. But if it's new for you, that's going to challenge you more and keep your mind active and in the moment, right? However, having said all that, there are strategies that can be utilized for those determined to listen only to the well-known pieces. And that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this section. Okay. So many of the tunes on Guns N' Roses' masterpiece, Appetite for Destruction, which was released in '87, have been largely played out for me, right? Particularly Welcome to the Jungle, Paradise City, Sweet Child of Mine, with Night Train, It's So Easy, and Rocket Queen getting pretty close to played out as well. And given the exceptionally high profile of these songs and their near constant rotation on satellite radio and the like, I'm guessing many others have reached similar saturation points as well, right? In addition, the album's rather basic glam punk metal mixture that it is, this brand of hard rock does not provide much fodder for contemplation, to be perfectly honest. They start to write more challenging epics sort of later on, right? So given the relative simplicity and familiarity of much of Appetite's, maybe almost every song on Appetite, but if not most of them, a different approach would be needed if one wants to make these songs part of their active listening regimen. The key is to concentrate on musical aspects rarely observed while simultaneously resisting the urge to reminisce, right? And then if that happens, redirecting the mind to the active. So if Welcome to the Jungle takes you back, that's what you don't want. You want to redirect to the present, right? And focus on something new that's going on, or new for you that you haven't really listened to before on that album. And I'm going to elaborate on that a little more in a second. All right. But first, let's just quickly do a quick little detour. So here's Guns N' Roses discography. You can see, as long as they've been around, they actually don't have that many albums. But Appetite for Destruction, that's the album we're sort of using as a case in point here. This is by far their most popular album, commercially successful album, has the most hits. It's also their heaviest album. Like, there's a lot of songs on this album. If they're not heavy metal, they're edging right up to it, right? GNR Lies, if you don't count the live part of this, is all acoustic. And then you've got Use Your Illusion 1 and 2 and the Spaghetti Incident, although they were released at different times. This is all really from the same session, right? This era of Guns N' Roses, and indeed Chinese Democracy, which came much later, in which Axl Rose, it's really Axl Rose and a bunch of session musicians. But anyway, any of these albums actually would be way better choices for mindful contemplation and keeping your mind active, because for most people, most of the songs haven't been overplayed. There's more variation in the music. There's more challenging epics and that kind of thing, right? But if you have to only listen to the well-known songs, or that's your preference, and you want to use appetite for mindfulness, you can, but you want to do it in a different way. So that's kind of what I'm saying here. Okay, let's jump back to the paper. All right. So if I were employing analytical active listening, and if you saw part 2, you'll notice that when I talk about using heavy music as a tool for mindfulness, there's sort of 2 stages of this, or there can be 2 stages. There's analytical active listening, in which you're actually analyzing the music as the album is going by, right? You might be comparing it to previous works or to other works that you know, but you're analyzing what's going on. And the non-judgment part of active listening is where now you're not judging at all. You're just listening to the music as it is, right? Both can be really helpful for mindfulness. So let's apply that to the appetite for destruction sort of scenario. So if I were to employ analytical active listening to appetite, much of my assessment would center on how some of these songs got so popular, given their comparative level of rawness and aggression, right? It is kind of a unicorn in a lot of ways. I can't think of too many albums that do this. Indeed, it's clear why hard rock and metal audiences would respond to, say, Slash's slashing guitar solos or Axl Rose's over-the-top vocal delivery. So I get that. But aside from, say, Sweet Child of Mine and its non-threatening lyrical content and sing-along chorus, and perhaps a couple others, much of appetite would be anathema or the opposite to what usually permeates mainstream musical tastes. And I think that's the case back when it was released in '87 and even arguably today. Thus, as each song was playing by and I was sort of analyzing it, I was analytically active in my listening. I'm analyzing appetite. As it's playing along, I would be trying to pick out the bits in the album that seem to unite both pop and metal audiences. Like I say, that's always intrigued me about this album. As heavy as it is and as hard rock and as metal in a lot of cases as it is, the pop audiences seem to love this album. I mean, other than maybe Metallica's Black Album, I can't think of too many others where that's the case. Maybe some stuff by AC/DC too unites both metal and pop audiences, maybe a Van Halen album too. But I think Appetite is maybe the best example of that because at its core, it's a pretty aggressive, raunchy album, right? So as the album's being played, I'd be analyzing that, and that's keeping my mind active, keeping me present, you know, I'm not worrying about the future or worrying about the past. I'm in that healthy presence, right? And that's where I want to be. So trying to identify Appetite's magic sauce would certainly keep my mind occupied and in the now as the album blasts on by, right? So again, it's approaching Appetite in a new way that keeps your mind engaged and gives you something new to think about, you might say. Right. And there'd be other things you might want to analyze too, but that's one that comes to mind for me. How the heck, what's so special about this album that unites those metal fans with the pop audience? Because that doesn't happen very often. Okay. But what about non-judgmental active listening? Here's where you're really concentrating on certain bits of music. And I did this in part 2, like I say, for Iron Maiden Senjutsu. Going to do something similar here for Guns N' Roses, but there's different things we're going to look for, and we're going to try to steer clear of, you know, those well-known choruses and some of the well-known guitar riffs, because again, we know those so well. There's nothing new to learn here. All right. So regarding non-judgmental active listening, I would point my attention away from the obvious vocal hooks and guitar riffs, as I was saying, which any fan of Appetite's going to know super well, and onto the more subtle parts of the musical delivery. Here's a few exercises that it could encourage active listening if you're going to choose Appetite for Destruction. I find bass lines absolute gold for this, right? If all else fails, concentrate on what the bass is doing, because again, even though you've heard Appetite a million times, like, you know, lots of times though you're hearing it, you know, in an elevator, you're hearing it on the radio as you're driving, whatever, and you're not really concentrating on it, but you're still hearing it more and more and more. You rarely can even hear what the bass player is doing, right? So if you make a point of, okay, I'm going to really focus on what Duff's doing on the bass, right? That for most people will be new, even though maybe you've heard Welcome to the Jungle and It's So Easy a million times. Have you really heard the bass, right? If you force yourself to listen to what's going on with the bass, that will keep your mind active, or it could, right? So I'd say challenge yourself to concentrate only on Duff's bass lines for at least 3 of Appetite's songs. Like start small, maybe just a couple songs. If you can do the whole album, great. By the time you're done Appetite, and if you've kept your mind active that whole time, I mean, Appetite's what, about 50 minutes long? It's amazing how at peace your mind would be. You gave it a break from worrying about the future or the past, right? You kept in the present and you gave yourself a real good break. That's kind of like meditation in a way. Right. So not only, if you just listen to Duff's bass for a couple songs or as long as you can, not only will this keep you in the now, but you actually might develop a new appreciation for how good this guy actually is too. Right. So again, you're trying to listen to an album you've heard a million times in a different way by picking out bits that you really didn't concentrate on before, probably. And unless you're a bass player, I would guess most people probably haven't really listened to it. Okay. Well, here's something more for the guitar people. Or in addition to this, I mean, the next time you listen to Appetite, maybe look for something different. So have you noticed that Izzy and Slash are typically the two guitarists are typically panned left and right in the soundstage, right? Usually one's more on the left speaker, one's more on the right speaker. And that their rhythm guitar tracks sound different in tone. So here I'm saying, don't just let your mind wander when you hear those riffs that you've heard a million times for Paradise City or whatever. Really concentrate on what the guitarists are doing. Notice how Izzy and Slash sound different because their setups are different, right? Listen to how they play the riffs, but each of them play them a little different. They accent the notes a little different or what have you. So listen for those subtleties, right? Again, if you do that from song to song, that's a good way for the guitar fanatics in the crowd to stay present. So just don't listen to the riff. Dissect that riff. Try to pick out what's Slash and what's Izzy and notice how they're playing the riffs just a little different from each other, right? Another exercise for the guitar fans is to closely listen to how Izzy alters the main riff under Slash's solos. I mean, they could be, the riffs under the solos could also be Slash because, I mean, obviously they can overdub, but I think a lot of it's Izzy. It doesn't matter. Just, when it's in the solo spot, do something different because most people will listen to the solo. Listen to what the rhythm guitar is doing underneath, right? Listen to how the riff is changed just a little bit when it goes into the guitar break, right? So that might be a cool exercise to look at. Rather than just the solos, listen to what's happening underneath. And maybe you also listen to what the bass and the drummer is doing too. But if you are going to listen to the solos, listen to them in a different way. Dissect them a little more. Can you pick out when Slash is using his beloved crybaby wah-wah guitar effects during the lead breaks, right? I mean, Slash really loves using the wah, but he doesn't use it all the time. Sometimes he plays a little cleaner, right? So when you're listening to the solo, see if you can pick out the different effects that he's using. Even if you don't know the names or whatever, if you're not familiar with guitar effects or the pedals or whatever, just notice how the tones are changing throughout the solos from song to song, or maybe even within the same song. Right. So again, you're concentrating on the more subtle parts. Even though you've heard these songs a lot, you probably haven't really focused on these parts. And that keeps your mind thinking, keeps you active, keeps you in the now. Right. Or drumming. Concentrate on how Steven Adler approaches drum fills. And I would argue, particularly, the most common times that drummers throw in fills is sort of when it's going into a chorus. So what we got a verse and you're leading into a chorus or perhaps a bridge. There's usually something. There's a fill that goes in to sort of bring you into the chorus or say a bridge, right? Well, concentrate on that, right? And do that again for at least a couple songs, or if you can do it for the whole album, again, more power to you, because if you've stayed really focused on one little bit of music, in this case, the drum fills, all the way through the album, A, I'll bet you've never really heard those before because they've just gone by you 100 times. And B, it's amazing how peaceful you'll be by the end of the album. Okay. So we can't leave Axl out here. With reference to the liner notes or via an online source, read the lyrics for Appetite. And I recommend you do this before you even put the album on or stream it or whatever you're doing. Just do this in silence, right? Read the lyrics from either the liner sheet or go online, okay? And it's funny because sometimes, especially with even with songs we've heard a million times, we think they're saying something, but they're actually saying something else, right? So make sure you actually know what Axl is saying. Right. And then once you've read the lyrics, right? You might be surprised how off you've been. I mean, that happens to me all the time. Once I really read, a song I've known forever, oh, that's what that line is, right? So that happens all the time, right? So that can be interesting, I guess, in its own right. But once you really figure out what the lyrics are, then when you hear the songs, identify what Axel is actually saying and notice how he emphasizes certain phrases, etc., right? So active listening can remedy various misinterpretations, which can be kind of interesting, but you might be surprised by the street wisdom of some of GNR's songs, right? So again, it's not just putting your mind on autopilot and humming along to "It's So Easy" when the chorus comes up. No, force yourself to really listen to each of the lyrics as they go by, right? And then what's Axel actually saying, not what you think he's saying, all right? Again, that's keeping you thinking. That's keep you in the moment, right? That's what you want to do for this type of thing. So again, just to wrap this part up, when I am when I'm employing analytical or non-judgmental active listening, as I've sort of broken it up, I'm unlikely to pick an album that I know extraordinarily well. So I'm not myself personally, I'm not likely to pick Appetite for Destruction. But for those of you who are, the above list might help those if that's the route you want to take, right? I should also state, though, that while Appetite for Destruction is not prototypical mindfulness music, at least not to me, it is perfect for fun listening. And in a different sort of way, that's worth a lot as well. So again, I don't want to devalue albums that we all know super well, right? You, of course, should keep listening to them. I'm just saying, if you want to employ mindfulness, it's better, I believe, to be challenged by things you don't know as well. But if you are going to use those albums, listen to them in a different way, as I was sort of listing above, right? But if you just want to listen to an album for fun or background, hey, knock yourself out. I could listen to Appetite for Destruction every day too. It's just that good, right? Anyway, I think you get where I'm going with this. All right, so that was part 3. In part 4, what I'm going to do, and I'm going to wrap this series up in part 4, I'm going to do a brief section on a few recommendations on how you might spruce up your music environment. I mean, the key to a lot of this, or most of this, is we're picking out for mindfulness, if we're using music, heavy music, to stay mindful, to stay present, right? A lot of it is trying to pick out the more subtle parts of the music and concentrate on that. That's what's keeping our mind active. But if you can't hear the music clearly, it's kind of defeating the purpose. So you might want to set up your listening environment a little better so that you can hear the instruments clear, or choose recordings that are just recorded in a more clear way. So I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail and provide what I hope are a couple helpful tips, as well as sort of concluding things in this series as well, where I'll reiterate a couple of things I've talked about, but I'm going to bring in a couple new things as well. All right, so thanks for listening and have a super mindful day. I wish you well, and hopefully I'll see you in part 4.